It's all rubbish. Don't buy it. Nothing's changed. Piers Morgan, if you genuinely are now more sceptical, more curious, give me a call. You know you can get my number. I can tell you stuff about the last 4 years that will blow your tiny mind. Let's see how curious you really are.
Breaking right now, a major row has broken out over Piers Morgan's authoritarian tendencies during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Bev Turner and June Slater have taken the former Good Morning Britain presenter to task for what was inexcusable behaviour over the course of the pandemic, which included, by the way, advocating for those who refused the COVID vaccine to not receive treatment in the National Health Service for anything. Piers, who is now obviously an independent broadcaster, has a very big channel, spoke with Tucker Carlson to try and, I would argue, rewrite history.
Now, where I was completely wrong was, you mentioned COVID. And it was interesting. It really changed my thinking about these things. In COVID, I got very, I think, overly emotionally engaged because I knew people who were dying of COVID, and it was awful. And in Britain, we handled it very badly. But I got led down a line which I wished I hadn't been led down. I'll give an example. When the scientists said, if you have the vaccine, you can't transmit the virus, I believed them. And I became wrongly censorious, really badly censorious. I was saying to people, if you don't have it now, knowing that if you have it, you can't transmit the virus, you're going to go and kill old people, you're going to kill people. It's not about you, it's about the people you may infect and kill. And it turned out to be completely wrong. They later said, months and months later, actually, there's no difference whether you have the vaccine or not in terms of transmitting the virus. And at that point, I realized I'd been misled completely.
Had you already gotten the vaccine?
Yeah.
Did you know that it made you impotent when you got it? I'd heard that. Is that not?
That's not true.
That's not true.
I can confirm that's not true.
Oh.
But here's my point.
I'm such a dick. I can't control myself.
No, but that's why I like you. It's why we get on so well. But the interesting point about both of them was that we were both kind of traduced by institutions into taking a position about something which turned out to be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And it really has made me, I just think coming out of the pandemic in particular, I've just now, next time round, with any of these things,
yes,
I'm going to be a lot more skeptical, as a journalist should be.
Yes.
So I'm pretty ashamed of.
And look, I guess it's always good when people admit they got it wrong. But the problem is, the way that Piers got that wrong actually had huge implications for the way that the British government dealt with lockdowns. Part of the reason that we are so catastrophically suffering as a country was because of the hysteria from that period. And by the way, if you were smart, if you were a good journalist, it was very easy to fight back against the narrative. I certainly did every single day of 2020, using my position in the mainstream media to try and bring some balance, even though so many folk wanted to cancel me for it. And my friend, Bev Turner, was totally cancelled by the mainstream media over that period, and she is not accepting Piers's weasel words today.
I've got to respond to Piers Morgan talking to Tucker Carlson about the fact that he now realises that he should be ashamed of how wrong he got the pandemic, particularly in relation to pushing vaccines on healthy people. He talks about the fact that he lacked scepticism and was emotionally involved. That's not true. It wasn't a lack of scepticism. It was willful ignorance. It was willful blindness. He knew, the people he worked with knew that I had another opinion on that situation, what we now know as the truth, scientific fact. He didn't want to talk to me during that period of time. In fact, just to demonstrate how little scepticism he still has, he blocked me on X, on Twitter, and he still has me blocked. Because anybody that disagreed with him, he blocked. And still does during that period of time. So don't buy this whole, I lack scepticism. Because if there is another pandemic, which there will be, this is what Piers Morgan will do. He will lick his finger, he will hold it in the wind, and he will wait to see which way public opinion is blowing, because that is what broadcasters like him do. It is not about truth or integrity or values. It is about popularity, which is why now he's doing this pivot and going on all these shows. And he knows that Tucker Carlson fans and Joe Rogan fans know that he was wrong. And he's desperately trying to get himself back in the favour with the public, having lost his talk TV show and now only being online. So it's all rubbish. Don't buy it. Nothing's changed. Piers Morgan, if you genuinely are now more sceptical, more curious, give me a call. You know you can get my number. I can tell you stuff about the last 4 years that will blow your tiny mind. Let's see how curious you really are.
And I'd like to see that, actually. I think Piers Morgan, if he's serious about this, should unblock Bev Turner and host her on Uncensored. But it is really just worth remembering how Piers allowed his woke ITV show Good Morning Britain to turn into government propaganda. I mean, look at actually how they broadcast over that period. In the background, every single day, they had the rainbow flag with a heart that said, NHS, we love you. June Slater, a good friend of mine, also furious about this.
So Piers Morgan is bleating on Tucker Carlson about how he got the pandemic wrong and he's sorry and he likes scepticism. You didn't like scepticism, you turned your back on knowledge. You followed one side of the science, you followed the government narrative. There was always a counter-narrative and it was offered up to you by people like Bev Turner, a fine journalist who stood by the courage of her convictions and lost her job because she was trying to put the truth out at the time. And what did you do? You basically talked about the unvaccinated like they were unclean. You, an investigative journalist, turned your back on information that would have given people a more balanced approach instead of the profit-driven narrative. If we had more Bev Turners than what we had Piers Morgans, a lot of people made a lot of different decisions because they would have had a full picture of what this drug was really capable of and what it lacked.
Let me bring in my superstar panel, Myron Sentinel, Nathan Reform UK star, former Brexit Party MEP James Glancy. Myron, where do you stand on this one? Do you accept Piers' apology today?
Well, I wouldn't even call it an apology because if you look at his language, he's playing the victim even in his apology. He's saying, I was led. That's the language he's using. So I don't really buy that at all. But I mean, there are two types of people. There were some people who perhaps, let's say, naively trusted the government when it came down to lockdowns, etc., because they thought that was just a nice thing and the proper thing to do in a pandemic and an emergency situation. But there were other people who not only trusted the government, saw this as a kind of tribal religious form of extremism, where, you know, being pro-vax, being pro-lockdown was a kind of extremist position to take, and that's what Piers Morgan represents. And he used that extremist position to talk down to, as June was saying, the unvaccinated as dirty peasants, impure people who should be dehumanized and denied rights. And all that's happened now is during the post-COVID situation, the lights have come on, the music stopped, and he's realized he's got no clothes on. And in a kind of post-Trumpian situation, we see Mark Zuckerberg changing his perspective on free speech. You know that Piers Morgan's going it alone. He has to kind of tout for the same kind of people that Joe Rogan appeals to, and so that's where he's coming at with this situation. He's like Bev Turner said, he's putting his finger in the wind, seeing where public opinion is going, where his career is going, and that's why he's saying the rhetoric he's saying at the moment.
Exactly. It is commercially motivated. And the problem is, and the big problem that I have, is that the hysterical coverage driven by the mainstream media during the COVID pandemic, a lot of it was commercially motivated. So, for example, I want to remind people, let's just take a look at this picture of a particular interview that Piers conducted with one of the government ministers at the time, Therese Coffey. Now, she actually hung up. But look at the propaganda just in this one screenshot. So you have the coronavirus pandemic image suggesting that it's getting everywhere, forced quarantine for arrivals as if that is a good thing. And then in the bottom right, an actual ticking clock of how many people had been vaccinated. James Glancy, Do you feel like this is genuine from Piers? But first, the reason you're watching this show is because you know that these days it's almost impossible to trust the mainstream media or the so-called fact checkers who claim to patrol social media. And that's for a very good reason, given the Brexit debate, COVID debacle, and demonization of Donald Trump. But I have the solution. Today's sponsor, Ground News, was created by a former NASA engineer to provide you with the only safe way to consume the headlines. So you can go to ground.news/outspoken to check it out for yourself. But what I want to do now is show you this incredible website and app in action. So what we're going to do is take the recent story, you will have heard us talk about it on the show, Elon Musk falling out with Nigel Farage all over Tommy Robinson, the political prisoner. The left-wing legacy media tried to whip this up and destroy all three men. But what's great when you look at the story on Ground News, and you can do this, by the way, with any story in the news, not just this one, but this is just one example. So Ground News has collated the 230 sources in one place. It then instantly shows how the story is being covered by the media, broken down by whether those organizations lean to the left or right. It's called its bias distribution service. Then you can see every article about the topic broken down by the political position and ownership of the publication. So in this case, it shows that Fox News, an outlet on the right, gave a fair analysis, whereas the likes of Mediaite and The Independent on the left didn't, which isn't a surprise, I guess. But what's so great about this app and website is that Ground News gets to know you personally, providing you with news stories you're interested in. You can choose lots of different categories like Brexit or Donald Trump or Premier League football. But it also analyzes your own biases and comes up with potential blind spots that you might not be hearing about. So I know you love the news. That's why you're watching Outspoken. But you probably don't trust the legacy media. Ground News gives you the tools to understand the truth about what is really going on in the world. I can speak personally and say it's now the only way I read the news. I have the app on my phone. It allows me to see through media bias and manipulative narratives without having to rely on the MSM to define what is true. So go to ground.news/outspoken to check it out. You can subscribe through my link for 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use for unlimited access. Ground News is all subscriber funded. For less than a Netflix subscription, actually. It means you can get all the world's news in one place and think for yourself. It truly has been a real game changer, I guess, for a news junkie like me. So let me repeat the address. ground.news/outspoken, or you can use the QR code on screen if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble. And the description is the link is in the description in the show notes below. But now, back to the show.
Well, I was one of the mugs to get vaccinated with Moderna. I've been very, very fit and healthy as a former Royal Marine. All my life, I still train. I got this pleurisy on the lungs, and when I saw the doctor, he said, it's really strange. Lots of men your age who are fit seem to be getting all sorts of weird things that we don't understand. So we were definitely forced into it. So I believe Piers, I like Piers, fellow Arsenal fan. I talked to him on a few issues from time to time. He says he got a motive. And he let emotion take control, and he did become part of the problem. He was wrong. But I would say this, you've got to understand what the government did to us. There's a unit called the Research Information Centre, RIC, at the heart of government. It's a propaganda unit to try and control the public narrative. It did it during the Southport riots. It does it to try and control what people think. And they use narrative and they corralled a number of social media organizations to frighten us to stay at home, to frighten us to get the vaccination. So I think there needs to be a wider investigation into government propaganda, because the government and the scientists got it wrong, and then they forced this narrative upon us. And I think if you think back to the wars that we've been forced into Iraq, for example, it's funny how the government creates a narrative, then the mainstream media comes alongside and they put all this pressure on people to say, this is the right thing. You're unpatriotic if you didn't support the war. And they use the same methods through the mainstream media, through their propaganda channels, this research information center, to develop a narrative. And if you fall foul of that, it'll be destructive for your life, and they make it so. So I think this is the wider narrative. We need an investigation into government propaganda.
Oh, well, we absolutely do. I couldn't agree more. But the thing is, the mainstream media were culpable for being the propaganda arm. So take a look at this picture here. So this shows you exactly what the government did over that period. Look at that. All of the regional newspapers from Swindon to Liverpool to Oxford to Brighton all ran a coordinated front page. And guess who paid for that? Guess who paid for that? The British government. And the British government was bankrolling all of these media organizations. These media organizations saw record ratings because everyone was sitting at home. So what else did you have to do? And I know because I was broadcasting on Talk Radio, the drive time slot, during that entire year, 2020. And we were like a lifeline to people on Talk Radio because the rest of the media was all about propaganda at all times. So at least we tried to break down that propaganda. But let me tell you, at great personal cost, that Tory MP, Neil O'Brien, he led a personal smear campaign against great journalists who were challenging the narrative, like Julia Hartley-Brewer and like Alison Pearson. So as I think you say, Myron, it's not good enough at the moment what we're getting from people like Piers. There has to be more responsibility for what you cause. And actually, when you look at the climate of what's happened this week, Myron, for example, the inevitable closure of Sly News, which is saying that they are going to be moving online only by 2030, if they even last that long. I think a lot of it harks back to the two big issues of our day, Brexit, which we obviously spoke about earlier, but also COVID. Because think about Sly News, for example. They were propagating this idea that everyone should stay home and follow the rules. And then their own presenters who were leading the FAIR campaign, Kay Burley and Beth Rigby, were actually partying it up, living it up, quaffing champagne, not following the rules themselves. They just happened to get caught because of pesky photographers. So I think it shows that the entire elite class over this period of time were not on the side of the people, and we will not forget it. And it is partly behind the huge move to Reform UK, but I think it's also why the MSM is dying this slow, painful death.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing across the country is the insurgence of Reform UK. You're seeing other parties across Europe surging up. So there's this whole kind of desperation, a lamentation almost from the populists of Britain and Europe and America to say we want something different. We want to tear down the establishment. And that's what Reform represents. It's what all these other parties, and it's what Trump represents. And Trump, look, for all his rhetoric, some of it perhaps inappropriate at times, what he's doing is, for example, with JFK, the JFK files, he's going to declassify them. The Epstein list are probably going to get released. What we're seeing is finally transparency. What we're seeing is, and when you see Donald Trump signing those executive orders, I was euphoric because it was actually democracy, the will of the people being exercised right before your eyes, the will of the people manifesting in policy, in reality. And that's what we're all yearning for. There has been such a huge democratic deficit with the COVID lockdowns, with the constitutional quangos that go on in Parliament. All of these things, there is such a yearning to actually just get the will of the people exercised. And Donald Trump is the beginning of that. And I hope to see a massive tremor across Britain and Europe, which will actually make that happen there as well.
Please God. And how astonishing, Myron, actually, that we are so excited about a leader who just does what they promised. But it is so refreshing. It is so wonderful. All of these people moaning about what Trump's doing at the moment. He warned you. He told you. This was part of his policy. He's not going off piste. And unfortunately, we have had politicians in the UK who have told us that they were going to cut net migration, for example, for decades, and they have done the total opposite, and it is disgraceful.
Dan, can I say,
please,
just very quickly, the information campaign used during COVID was the same. They did that for Brexit. They got all the institutions, all the media. It's the same methodology telling us we're idiots, you don't know what you're talking about. And it turns out that we do. And they lied. They said the economy would immediately crash at $500,000. They lied, and they will continue
instant
to lie.
recession. Yeah, exactly. Project Fair. And then COVID was Project Fair Part 2. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.